Today, we're going to be speaking with Alissa Quart, who's the executive director of the Economic Hardship Reporting Project and also author of the book Bootstrapped, Liberating Ourselves from the American Dream. Alissa, it's so great to have you on. I think many in our audience will understand this idea of bootstrapping, pulling oneself up by the bootstraps. The idea is, while it may be an impossibility according to mechanical physics to pull oneself up by their own bootstraps, it's the idea of taking responsibility for your situation, the idea of deciding that you're going to improve your circumstances for yourself. And it can be very motivating in some sense, but it also has been used to sort of blame the poor for their circumstances, to blame those in less than ideal circumstances for the circumstances in which they find themselves. Can you talk to us a little bit about where this concept came from and originated?
Yeah, it's so funny that we're talking today, and it's right after the first Republican debate, and it was just teeming with mentions of, I did this myself. Tim Scott, what's his name? The new
Vivek Ramaswamy.
Yeah. Who really arguably did not have anything to do with bootstraps. He was born on third base, etc. But they kept kind of harkening back to this mythos as a way to puff themselves up and make themselves into the deserving candidate. And it's because it worked for Donald Trump in part. Again, another false bootstrapping narrative. But yeah, the secret of the bootstrap idiom is that it didn't mean that at all. It started out as an absurdity. They described a farmer trying to pull himself up by his bootstraps. He was like the town fool. And they described this is like in the 19th century, and they described an inventor who was kind of quixotic and in the Midwest. And again, he was completely, it was pulling himself up by his bootstraps. It's like tilting at windmills. And then over time, this idea that somehow you could pull out your boots on and then pull yourself up, which is the paradox that's actually being asked of us, right? An impossible paradox in this country. Becomes normalized and becomes something that we aspire to. And what's interesting, because I looked at a lot of these figures of speech, Horatio Alger's story, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, meritocracy also did not mean what we think it means, coined in 1958. It was actually seen as another kind of almost impossible dream, it wasn't seen as a goal. And it just sort of interested me that of course, these American idioms begin as jokes.
Without a doubt. And one of the other narratives that I think is important here is how this ties into perception of and support or opposition to a variety of social programs. I mean, these ideas, whether they start as a joke or not, they become very useful often to a particular sort of politics that seeks to either justify or attack social spending programs that seek to help people. And this could be anything from food stamps throughout the pandemic. There were a number of different programs that were relevant to this idea of helping businesses or not, helping individuals or not. Part of this seems to be also the implicit criticism that if you've received help, that is a less valid way of achieving. Is that also an element to this?
Oh, absolutely. It's a very punitive framework. And I'm glad you brought up the pandemic era programs, because things like the child tax credit or like the PPP loans or, the Rescue Act and the relaxed so-called standards for Medicaid and food stamps, which allowed people to stay on the rolls, allowed people to get food stamps when they needed them. They had amplified budgets during the pandemic. They've now been kind of cruelly cut back. I actually was just talking to someone in San Francisco who is starving because they can no longer get enough food stamps, and they're disabled as well. And that is the kind of punishment that comes with this expectation that we're supposed to do this on our own. And those brief moments like the pandemic, like the 1930s, WPA and other social programs of the New Deal that gave people what they needed without guilt and shame. To me, those, I know that we can't always sustain them economically, but I think the spirit of generosity and the general impetus, including things like UBI, which the technology crowd likes, that should be a focus. That should be a focus for keeping people whole, especially as we're going to see, AI and robots supplanting a lot of us. We really need to think about how do we keep a baseline. But first, we have to get rid of some of these ideological carapace where we humiliate people around not doing it themselves. I mean, the truth of the matter is none of us really do it ourselves. And I can get into that. I mean, from infancy on, we are dependent on others.
Yeah, so I've talked about that a lot. The idea that sometimes I'll even be interviewed about my show and people say, wow, it's incredible how you've really built this thing completely by yourself, sort of thing. And I'll think to myself there was a combination of initiative as well as timing and sort of odds. But there's also the fact that I had a couple of years, thanks to living at home and parents who were stable, to just kind of try this out before I had to get a real job. That's a circumstance beyond my control where if I had to get a full-time job right out of grad school, or even just skipped grad school and gotten a full-time job right out of undergrad, I wouldn't have been able to do this. The fact that YouTube developed and existed and provided a place to host video files, which previously would have cost an insane amount of money. But even beyond that, employees who went to public universities, who now work for me, whose educations were subsidized by taxpayers. All of these different things, it's so hard to even, it seems silly almost to feel like you've bootstrapped or done it all yourself when you really think it through.
Yeah, and if you see people like Elon Musk, who, the federal government for Tesla and other products gave them, research and development grants. State of California gave them tax breaks. It just that's just at the top. But there's so many of us, who walk on city streets and drink clean water and are dependent on, as you said, schooling. Who dependent on people fixing the motorways. Depending on a range of services that. And also just dependent on the people in our social milieu, that even people who imagine they're doing it on their own are dependent on their wives or their partners' daycare for their kids and daycare providers if they're paying for that. And, I think there's a lot of hidden and invisible labor that gets kind of deleted, as somebody put it, one of my sources, invisibilized, which I sort of love the rawness of invisibilized by some of these storylines that we're telling ourselves in this country. And it deletes people. It deletes what they call in business also externalities, right? Which is all the things, including things like, infrastructure, tax breaks that have allowed some of these people who claim to do it on their own to thrive. And also their workers, let's put it that way. I mean, I'll never forget Michael Bloomberg when he was on, this was another Democratic debate with Bernie Sanders. He said, I did this, I built this company by myself. And Bernie Sanders said, I think your employees would be very surprised with that. Right. And I just was like, that's a great, just those kind of constant reminders to people that, there's a lot of people, as you just said, you have people, I got an email from one of them telling me, what's your schedule today, for your show, right?
Right. What importance do you place on the personal hypocrisies of folks that are involved with these stories? I mean, just to give a couple of examples, you talked about Trump, who started his business with a small loan of $1 million from his dad, as he famously said. But Ayn Rand, for example, who received benefits from many of these programs while advocating for self-sufficiency and against them and self-reliance, et cetera, and, fill that in with 1,000 other stories in between. What level of importance or significance do you place on the personal hypocrisies of some of those who advocate for these types of thinking?
I mean, I sort of, so there's something in literature, I was a grad school dropout, the biographical fallacy. We weren't supposed to look at the actual human biographies of the people doing the writing. We're supposed to just look at the writing as a pure text. But you can't help it when you have someone like Ayn Rand or Horatio Alger, who are these architects, or some part of, and obviously, I mean, political speeches, people like Donald Trump or Herbert Hoover, whose personal biography does not match at all with what they're arguing for, or even what they're saying about themselves.
Yeah.
But someone like Ayn Rand was dependent on Medicare and Social Security at the end of her life.
Right.
And they try to justify this, the Ayn Randians, when, they some of them have sent me letters, oh, it's because she had to pay taxes. So because she, the cruelty of having to be a taxpayer justified the fact that she got Social Security and Medicare. But it's pretty obvious that flies in the face of her ideology of utter self-sufficiency and dominance and power and will. But the truth is, none of us have a will and dominance to victor over old age and death. And that part of this is a sort of post-human sensibility, I think, where, you don't have a body, you don't have you're not dependent on others profoundly when you're born. I mean, my line here is, if you think you're self-made, call your mother. We come from people. Yeah. So Ayn Rand's biography, in other words, Ayn Rand's biography is very pertinent. And this idea, she came from Russia. She was, immigrant Russian Jewish striver who, really reacted badly. I think it was to the first revolution, the first communist revolution, when her family left, and then became, this very strident and extreme capitalist. And the fact that she was allowed to immigrate as a white immigrant in the 20th century is sort of, again, one of those externalities. Like, well, that happened. You came to a country that permitted you to become yourself, and yet that's a form of care, right? That we have to acknowledge as well.
When it comes to making the empirical case against some of these ideas, one sort of package of statistics that's often cited is about mobility, and that those who are born into poverty are statistically very unlikely to leave it. And, you often hear stories of celebrity and athletic performance, but like when you talk about big picture, it is true that you are far more likely to live and remain in poverty if you were born into a poor family. And conversely, that you're quite likely to stay wealthy if you're born to a wealthy family. And that would seem to be a relatively open and shut case, but it's not accepted as such. By all. Can you talk a little bit more about making the empirical case for this self-made ideology sort of not matching reality?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think it matched more in the earlier part of the century. So, I mean, one of the reasons why people like Ayn Rand might have had traction then wasn't just that people were pitiless, but that there were immigrants who were making it more easily. And there's a famous study by Raj Chetty and other scholars, I think they were all Harvard affiliated, that people born in 1940 had a 92 or 93% chance of excelling beyond their parents. And people born in the 80s had a 50% chance. So that's like a pretty striking shift in mobility numbers. And there's loads more, mobility if you're a parent, mobility if you're a American of color, a woman of color, all this is not what we've been promised and what this story would describe. There are a lot of blocks on things like mobility, which is an opportunity, which isn't to say that talent doesn't matter. So I feel like that's often the pushback to this, like, oh, but there are people who are objectively gifted and they work really hard and they put their butt in the chair and they achieve these things. I'm like, yeah, that's great, but I do think we need to think about the obstacles for many people from having that even that possibility, right? And celebrating when people can achieve this. My organization, EHRP, Economic Hardship Reporting Project, we had a series of articles about people who, I think it was called like the person who said yes, like people who had, guy was formerly homeless and he's a fellow at EHRP, he's a wonderful writer and a journalist, and he found a mentor who said yes, who helped him. And that was talent, and that meant that was opportunity. That was actually also like a university that gave him, a safe haven, right? So that, talk about externalities, that was an externality there, right? That actually did make a difference. So I think, that we can victor over some of these limits, but it's very hard for a lot of people, and we should be talking about that openly.
The book is Bootstrapped, Liberating Ourselves from the American Dream, and we've been speaking with the book's author, Alissa Quart. Really appreciate your time today and your insights.
Oh, thank you again, David. Lovely to meet you.